Welcome to the Droidcon Italy webinar. My name is Francesco. I'm one of the organizers of Droidcon Italy. Today you'll be hearing from Cris Pintea on micro-frontends. For question and answer, you can use the YouTube comments. Please post your question there. This webinar is brought to you by Synesthesia and powered by Bluetooth. Thank you, Cris. Have a great webinar.
Thank you, Francesco. Thanks for having me. Thank you all for attending. My name is Cris Pintea, and today I'll be sharing some of my thoughts on micro-frontends and mobile apps. So I work for a tech startup called Usophy, and my journey with micro-frontends starts with our web app, which when we started out, it was just a prototype, and we didn't really pay too much attention to the architecture. Well, what happened is that the code base soon became really messy. And on top of that, we really wanted to try some new frameworks, but really couldn't, because that would have meant rewriting the whole app. And as you can imagine, no one really wants to do that. So micro-frontends were kind of the natural solution to all these problems for us. And I would like to share with you how we discovered them. Now, I'm not an expert on micro-frontends by any means. So rather than focusing on implementation details, I will tell you my story, and hopefully you can take away some conclusions from it and make your best choices on micro-frontends. But I will be sharing some resources at the end, including my favorite divulgators on the topic. Now, before we dive into it, a quick word about Usophy, just for context. Usophy is an over-the-top subscription service to textbooks, in particular university textbooks. We are a very small team, and we are a startup, so we change a lot and very fast. Also, in our software, we really need to account for quick growth and potentially blitz scaling. So the software really needs to reflect that. It needs to be ready. We need to minimize costs because as a startup, for us, every bit of money that we spend translates into days or weeks off of our runway. For a startup, the runway is how much time you have to keep trying before you eventually run out of money. Finally, for us, great user experience is really key because our target user is very young. It's a university student. So he's used to using some very nice to use apps. So we really need to match that. So this is the story of our architecture and how it eventually evolved into micro-frontends. We started with something that is fairly standard in today's applications, really, which is the MERN monolith. You start with a MongoDB backend, a MongoDB database, a Node.js backend, and a React app for your front end. This is really great. It's very quick to set up and it's cheap. So for a startup, is really the best you can have. As a startup, you really want to focus on trying confirming your business model, seeing if it works. So you don't really want to invest too much effort into developing your prototype. But obviously, it does have some downsides. Importantly, it's limited in its scaling because anytime you have an excessive load, you want to scale it up, you have to scale the whole thing up. And then because it's a monolith, really it starts growing really huge, and all of your mistakes, they pile up and they start clogging everything. They start making the development experience not very pleasant. Finally, but not less importantly, it locks you in technologically, which means because it's just one application, if you wanted to change your stack, you'd really have to rewrite the whole thing. And although I admit that in my wildest dreams, I do that, in practicality, it's not a bright idea. So as soon as so the first part to really start showing some pain was our backend. And as soon as we started seeing those problems, we figured out that probably the best solutions was switching to microservices rather than having a monolith backend. So the microservices solved a lot of these problems for us on the backend. To begin with, microservices scale vertically, which means that if, for instance, you have a very aggressive marketing campaign, you're going to see a lot of people signing up to your application. But maybe not so many people changing their settings or uploading files. And so there's no point in scaling up those microservices. Rather, you can only scale, you can just scale the registration part. And that comes up to be cheaper and more effective. Also, it comes down to smaller code bases, because obviously your big application is just divided into smaller chunks, and this is just so much more manageable. Your code is going to be so much more tidy. And also because of that, you get easier deploys, because every time you make a change, you only need to deploy the microservice where you have actually made that change. Microservices is actually really popular and widely adopted in today's world, both in big and small companies alike. So it was really easy to find resources on this and to do it properly. A couple important things about microservices to note is, of course, they're technologically agnostic, which means you can really write a microservice with the framework and the language that you prefer. And that is really cool, because you can keep up with innovation. You can pick the language that's most appropriate for what the microservice does. And not only that, but you can even tell your developers, you can actually pick the the framework that you feel the most comfortable with. Of course, not always. That is not always possible, but it's a really interesting concept. Finally, migrating to microservices is actually not that difficult, because if we just go back and look at the MERN stack, you will note that your monolith is essentially the same thing as a microservice. The only difference is there is just one. So you just take your monolith, you encapsulate it so it becomes a microservice, a giant microservice, and then you make it an effort to, every time you need to add a new feature, instead of adding it in the monolith, you're just going to add it in a new microservice, the one where it belongs. And if you put in the effort that we did, you're going to find yourself after a couple months with everything just split into all of the microservices and no more responsibility on the original monolith. So after a couple months, we could easily delete the monolith and just remain with all the new microservices that were well organized and pleasant to work on. And so what was step 3? Well, as this worked out really well, this microservices worked out really well for us, and our backend team is really loving working on it, and we're not really having many problems on our backend ever since. But our frontend is now a bottleneck in our production line, and mostly because the project is so complicated and it's just got so many things going, so many places where business logic shouldn't be, and yet it is. And so we really wanted to fix this without rewriting the whole app. And so our idea was micro-frontends. Although at the time we didn't know it was called that, and we didn't even know that the community was actually embracing it. There were some pretty big companies also already using it. So the first idea was, okay, you know what? Let's take this big web app and split it into smaller web apps. There's nothing stopping us from doing it. And so we started doing it with our landing page. As soon as we had to remake our landing page, we just implemented it in Svelte, because we wanted to try Svelte. It's a new framework, similar to React. In so many ways, or at least for what it does, and we loved it. Actually, Svelte was really cool. It allowed you to be quicker for many things than you could be with React, and also the output of the build from Svelte was so much lighter than React, and so the page would load so much quicker, and we really liked it. We decided we wanted to do more with it, and so the next step, a few weeks later, when we decided to completely re-implement our login and registration flow, we decided to keep going that way and just go ahead and implement it in Svelte. Now, the difference between the landing page and the registration flow is obviously that the landing page doesn't really interact that much with the rest of your application. But obviously, the login and registration does. And so we looked at how to make those communicate. And the most obvious manner for us was local storage. I mean, the web app is already using local storage for storing state and persistence, so we can just tap into that local storage and write to it, and this way we'll just communicate. And so we did, and it worked. The routing between micro-frontends, in this case, in this solution of ours, is done by the server side. So based on the route that the client has requested, the server will serve a different micro-frontend to the user. And this is what we currently have into production. Now, This is really cool because it does fit all of the solutions from microservices. First of all, the micro web apps, they're independent, they're technology agnostic. In fact, one is in React, the other is in Svelte. But really, we could keep adding there and make the next one in Vanilla.js, and the following one make it in I don't know, WebAssembly or Vue, whatever. And also, there is the division of responsibility, which means that the code bases are much smaller, they're easier to handle, they're more enjoyable to work with. The deploys also got so much easier because we only deploy the part that we are editing. There is one drawback in our implementation, in our current implementation, which is that because the routing is done server-side, you really need a server for the routing. And so when you're working on it in your development environment, you're going to need to start up every single micro front end on your local machine. And then you're going to need to start up one more server that is going to handle the routing between the servers of every single micro front end. That is not very clever, and it's not very comfortable. That's why I will talk to you very soon about what our next future step is. But this is our current stage. This is what we have in production. Now, this is also the moment when we really started looking at, oh, look, there's our people doing this. And actually, there's a lot of our people doing it, and it's called micro-frontends. And what we found out is that one of the reasons that bigger companies adopt micro-frontends is actually completely different from the reasons why we adopted it. And in fact, they mainly adopted because it allows them to have independent teams. In fact, what we have created almost by accident by making the backend into microservices and the front end into micro-frontends is that now our stack is made up by entirely vertical sections that do not really depend on each other. And so if you just split your application and give the responsibility for these parts to different teams, the teams can work on their own project, on their own part of the project, without ever having really to depend on one another or wait for one another, without worrying about breaking stuff for the other teams. But for us, it's not really that. This is a code that shows a little bit more what we were trying to achieve with micro-frontends. It says that sharing domain models across bounded contexts becomes more difficult, so developers are less likely to do so. And this is all about talking about the process. If your process makes it hard to make mistakes, then you won't be making mistakes. And if you find yourself making mistakes very often, that's probably because of your process. Well, in our monolith, we found ourselves making the mistake of using writing business logic where it wasn't supposed to be very often. And micro-frontend solves that for us in a way that is very natural, because the business domains are completely separate. It's much harder to build interconnections between the micro-frontends by chance. So where are we taking this from here? We looked at routing, and right now we have server-side routing, as I said, but the idea of having client-side routing is very interesting because it allows you to have a part on the client side that is always loaded. In other words, the page doesn't need to refresh. The page doesn't need to refresh in order to switch micro-frontend. This means you can have a static loader that's always there, the page doesn't flash. And also, you start being able to do some very interesting things like dynamic loading and preloading and stuff that I'll get into a little bit later. And so the solution for us is this. It's that container application that you see there on the bottom that's handling the routing between the micro-frontends. That's what we're working on currently. Its responsibilities are essentially those. It handles routing between micro-frontends, loading the micro-frontends, and unloading and resetting the state before changing the micro-frontend. Also, it acts as a communicator between the micro-frontends. That's what orchestrates the communication between micro-frontends. In fact, you could call it a front-end orchestrator, just like, for example, Kubernetes is, in a way, an orchestrator for backends. This is another code that I really like, and that also shares what we're trying to achieve with micro-frontends. It says, in short, micro-frontends are all about slicing up big and scary things into smaller, more manageable pieces, very much like microservices are. So I mentioned earlier, there's some fairly big companies that actually do use micro-frontends, and these are just some of them. For example, the Zon is one of the most public about their use of micro-frontends because of Luca Mezzalira, who is their VP of architecture. And he has a lot of very nice, very interesting content about micro-frontends. You'll find them also in the last slide where I share some resources. And what they do is they dynamically load some single-page applications inside of their container application, which is very similar to what we're trying to achieve. They've written their own framework for it, and we were very inspired by what they're doing and what we're trying to achieve. But also Spotify, for example, they use iframes. A lot of people, when they hear iframes, they think, oh my God, what? Iframes are a really old technology. But actually, precisely because of that reason, they're very stable. They're something that we've tried for a long time. Also, iframes have a very distinct benefit of providing complete isolation between environments. And that means that, for example, your CSS, you don't have to worry about it conflicting between micro-frontends and so on and so forth. Zalando also have their proprietary framework for doing this, and they also do it with great results. And finally, IKEA has recently started doing something very similar, and they do it with a different technique, which is called edge side includes. And it's essentially, well, what the term says, you include the various micro-frontends on the edge, that is, on your CDN. And so because you do it on your CDN, on the edge, it's so much quicker than routing on the server side like we're doing currently. So as you can see, micro-frontends is really much more an idea, a concept, an architecture, way more than it is any particular way of implementing it or any particular framework. So until now, it has been all very abstract, but let's try to go and look at an actual example of micro-frontends. So this is one of the simplest examples I was able to find, and it uses iframes. So as you can see, it's very simple. It just has an iframe, and then it has a script which has a map of all the micro-frontends to their path, to their route. And then simply based on the current path name, it chooses which micro-frontend should be loaded, and it loads it into the iframe. This is very simple, but it counts as a micro-frontend, technically. A slightly more complex example is, on the other hand, a little bit more similar to what the Zon does, which is loading the JavaScript, the bundle of your single-page application at runtime, and then just having it render into the same page. And so you see that it's importing these three scripts, and then simply, again, it has the map of a global function to the route, to the current route, and then based on what the current path name is, it will pick the function to call. Now, each of these scripts, what are they? Well, they could be literally any React bundle or any other kind of framework for single-page applications. Really, the only difference is rather than what you have by default in your Create React App setup, where your entry point will render directly to the root element inside of your HTML page. Here, you modified the entry file so that rather than rendering right away into the root, it just exposes a function that, when called, will cause the single-page application to be rendered inside a particular element. And so that's exactly what we do. Now, there's some interesting stuff you can do here if you want to increase the complexity a little bit. For example, here we are importing all of the scripts all together on load. But rather than doing that, we could first check what the current route is, understand which is the micro-frontend that we need for that current route, and only then actually go ahead and add a script tag dynamically to download that script and start rendering it. This means that your page will load a lot faster. Not only that, but you can even do preloading. What does it mean? It means that when you have a reason to believe that the user will soon visit a different microservice, you can start loading that microservice before the user has gone there. So for example, how do you do that? You could put hover listeners on every link on your page and then control what that link is going to. And if that link is going to a different microservice, then you can say that, when the user hovers on this link, I will already start preloading that microservice so that when he clicks on it, it will already be loaded and will go there right away. It will be rendered right away. This decreases your initial load time because you only dynamically load the parts of your application that are needed, and also it decreases, it keeps a very low transition time between pages because you also preload the other pages while the user is just looking at the page and not doing much. If you want to take it one step further, you could even look at your Google Analytics insights and see for each route, what are the most visited next steps from here. So you could say that, okay, from the home page, the most visited route is the profile page. So you'll know that, and as soon as you finished rendering the home page, you'll already start preloading the profile page and the second and third most likely next destination, so that when the user eventually goes there, you'll find it already loaded. So I've talked about micro-frontends and what we are trying to do with it, and this was our experience so far. We're still playing with it, but so far it has been a really nice experience. But the title also includes mobile apps, and this is something that's a bit more of a creative idea from our part. We haven't really seen it out there, and unlike with micro-frontends, we haven't made the mistake of not researching it. This time we've researched it, and truthfully, we haven't found much luck out there. But because we're a very small team, we can't really afford to maintain a mobile app. Definitely not a native mobile app. And so initially we thought about, okay, let's do a hybrid mobile app. So we started with React Native. We started developing our proof of concept, started developing features. But soon after, we realized it was still unsustainable. We just didn't have the resources it took to maintain that app, and especially to maintain it updated with our web app. So it didn't really make sense for us. So the next attempt was a web view app, where because our web app was already responsive, we decided, okay, let's just put a web view in this app, and then we'll have the front end in it. Now, of course, this sounded like a smart idea because it will still allow you to be present on the app stores, even though you don't really have an actual app. If you think about it, you're not really adding any value to the customer. Nothing that the web app isn't already doing. And so we don't really like this. And the next idea we had, since we were starting to think about micro-frontends, is, well, okay, how about this? We'll have the mobile app be a substitute for our application container. So in a way, it will be a different version of it, a native version of the application container in our micro-frontend architecture. And then we'll have routes in the app just be micro-frontends, the same micro-frontends that we use on the web. Okay, cool. So at this point, really, we're back to our web view app. If you think about it, we just use all of the micro-frontends from the web inside the web view. Only instead of having a monolith in a web view, we have different web views with different micro-frontends. So what has changed, really? Well, what has changed is that now we're able to discriminate and say, okay, you know what? Some of these micro-frontends we'll take from the web, but this one, which is really important for us, it's the core of our experience, we'll actually develop it as a native component, and we'll give the user a native experience. And so effectively, our app becomes a bit of a hybrid between hybrid components, not really even native, because we're still thinking about doing it in React Native, and some web components. So this is what that architecture might look like. So you see, you still have your container application, only now, instead of being a web app, it is a mobile app. And then it will load the micro-frontends, only instead of loading all of the micro-frontends from the web, it will load some of them selectively from a native component rather than from a web component. And this is actually really cool for us because, first of all, it allows us to work incrementally on our mobile app. So because we don't really have a lot of resources to dedicate to the mobile app, we can instead decide, okay, when we have the resources and they're not really doing anything else, well, then we'll have them working on the mobile app. And we'll have them working on implementing new micro-frontends in the mobile app. But in the meanwhile, the app is still working. It's still fully functional. It's just that the more effort we put into it, the better the experience becomes, and the more native it becomes. The other great benefit of this idea for us would be that it will enable for us some very easy flavoring. What do I mean by that? In our particular business scenario, we have a couple different flavors of our same application. So, for example, in the past, we've had a version of our application that served open source books, and a different version that served books for kids. And soon we will release our version that has university textbooks. So because we have these 3 different versions, each of them might have slightly different features. And by using this technique, it's really easy to separate the features and just say, you know what, based on the flavor, I will just selectively enable some micro frontends and disable some others. And so I'll just put the specific features in their own micro frontend, so I can then selectively enable or disable them. The other thing that this enables, still in the realm of flavoring, is because we're targeting the app stores, the iOS and the Android app stores. The iOS app store has some very strict policies on in-app purchases, and because we're a subscription service, well, you might be aware of what's going on with subscriptions on the App Store. So, for example, if you download Netflix, just an example, you won't be able to start your subscription from the iOS app because the App Store policies do not allow it. Not only that, but they're not even able to tell you precisely you should go to the website to start your subscription, because also the App Store policies don't allow that either. So instead, they tell you you cannot start a subscription from the mobile app. Come back when you already have one. So a lot of things like this, and in particular, this situation, this idea really solved this situation for us, because it allowed us to just say, okay, you know what? Then all of the part that has to do with payments and subscriptions, we'll just disable that for the iOS version and keep it enabled for Android. And so this is what I mean by flavoring. The other things are, well, the mobile app will keep up to date naturally with the web app, because it's effectively just the same micro frontends from the web app. But at the same time, it's free to add its unique features. So, for example, right now we're planning on adding offline capabilities for the mobile app, but we don't really care about offline capabilities for the web app. And so this is the kind of feature that we go into the container application, which will then make it available to all of the micro frontends. So this is also an idea that's currently in the works, and we're prototyping it. It seems to work so far, and it really solves our problems. So we'll just see how this goes. I'm really excited. This is a really hot topic on my mind right now, so I'm really excited. And this is the end. So I want to thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts on this. Now I will be there for some 5 minutes to answer your questions or more if there are. But just before that, I would like to show you that on the last slide, I've shared some of my favorite resources on micro frontends. So the slide is available, and its link is in the description if you wanna look it up. And also, if you have any questions that you would like to ask at another moment or anything, you can hit me up on Twitter.
Thank you, Cris. Okay, Cris will be taking questions shortly. I'd like to once again thank our sponsor, Bluetooth, and let you know that our next webinar will be on Tuesday, 14 July at 11 o'clock. Hope to see you there. Back to you, Cris, for the questions. Thank you again.
Thank you, Francesco. Well, I don't see any questions in the chat, so I suppose there are none. And well, that would conclude our webinar. Thank you for attending.
Yes, you can find all the slides on Slido. The link is in the YouTube comments, and we will publish this video very soon on YouTube channel, Droidcon YouTube channel. Thanks again, Cris.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.